Hey friends, it's Anna. I am super excited for today's video where we'll be unpacking all the books I read in February while setting up my reading journal spreads for the month. I don't know about you guys, but my reading obsession comes in waves, and last month I got hit with a big one. I found a new favorite book that just triggered this irresistible urge to continue devouring story after story, so I can't wait to share that reading journey with you. Grab some tea or coffee, get cozy, and let's dive in. I'm starting with my cover page on the left, and then on the right side I'll make a reading summary for the month. I read all fantasy books in February, which is kind of rare for me. I'm usually reading more of a mix of genres, but because of that, I wanted the spreads for this month to create a kind of medieval fantasy vibe. So I found some pictures on Pinterest to start with, and I'm decorating around those with some scrapbook paper bits, and as you saw, some old book pages from Harry Potter. I'm sticking with mostly neutrals and browns here to give it that old-timey look, but in a second we'll add a little color and gold with some washi tape. I'm using this tape roller to paste all those in, and that paper strip in the middle is for the title. I cut that out of some tea stain paper, which I use a lot in my reading journal. I do stain the paper myself, and I'll link the tutorial video I use below in case you're also interested in tea staining your paper. I'm stamping the title using my alphabet stamp set, and that's our collage base before sprucing it up with some color and flowers. Oh, and I'm also going to go over the title with a fine liner to bold the letters. And this is where Coco decided to pay me a visit as well. She is always very eager to help out with my journals. Like I mentioned, I wanted these pages to feel very vintage, like they could exist in an old fantasy world where they're still fighting with swords and using quills and old maps on parchment paper, since that represents the vibe of most of the books I read. I did want to have some vibrance and color though, so I'm going to add a few washi tapes. The peony tape is from a vintage natural set I got on Amazon, and these gold floral tapes are part of the vintage botanicals set from the washi tape shop. I'll link both of these sets along with all the other supplies I'm using in the description box below, and I'm also an affiliate with the washi tape shop, so you can always use my code ANNABRUNS10 to get 10% off your entire order if you want to check out these botanical tapes or any of their other products. I'm adding in a few other smaller tapes to finish up the page. This was one of my easiest cover pages because I got to just collage together the elements and play around with adding the tape and stickers, but I love how it turned out and how the more delicate florals complement the base collage. Also, when the gilded gold catches the light, it's so pretty. Moving on to this right side, I'm going to make a summary page of my reading for the month with covers of each of the books I read and some stats for my reading. I print these book covers by getting the pictures from Goodreads and resizing them on Google Docs, and I make the graphs for all my reading stats in Canva. I read 7 books in February, like I said, all in the fantasy genre, and on the next few pages is when we'll start talking about each book and making individual spreads for each one. Like I mentioned, I found a new favorite series this month. It's probably not the one you're thinking it is from these book covers, but I'm so excited to give you guys all my thoughts. I'm creating a little header section up top with the number of books I read, and I used another scrap from my old Harry Potter book and some washi tape to decorate around it. The bottom half of this page is where I'll paste in some reading stats from February. I'm including 4 stats this month: my ratings, format of the book, genre, and the time I spent reading each book. I originally printed all the graphs in varying shades of brown, but I thought it ended up looking a little boring, so I reprinted 2 of them in green. Diving a little more into each stat, this first one gives me a look at how long I typically spent on each book this month. I read 3 of these books in under a week, 2 of them within 1 to 2 weeks, and 2 of them within 3 to 4 weeks. The genre stat was pretty boring this month since I read 100% fantasy. Usually that one's a little more interesting. Next, we have book format because I, in recent months, have gotten really into audiobooks. So in February, I listened to 2 of these books on audio, and the other 5, I read their physical copy. Last, we have ratings. It was a reading month of highs and lows. I had 1, 2, and 3 star respectively, 3 4 stars, and 2 5-star books. I love geeking out over these reading stats each month. It's so fascinating to me, and it's also helpful because at the end of the year in my journal, I like to collect these all into annual reading stats, which is so much fun to look at. I'm finishing off the spread with some more washi tapes, and as you can tell, I'm constantly changing around the tapes and trying them out in different spots before they find their final home. And those are my completed cover pages. Moving on to our next pages, which will be spreads for each individual book. I change up how much space I allot to each book based on how much I have to write or how much I liked it, and these first 2 books became some of my new absolute favorites, so each one is getting its own full page. I'm talking about the Dance of Thieves duology. These are the books I mentioned in the beginning of the video that I could not put down and put me into such a fantasy mood that I proceeded to read 5 other fantasy books. This duology is one of those popular fantasy romance series, although I don't see this one being as hyped up as some other series, which makes no sense to me because I think this is definitely my favorite romantasy that I've read. The books are set in a high fantasy world, and we're following Kazi, who's a reformed street thief and now a highly skilled soldier for her queen. And then our other main character is Jace, who's the leader of his not quite kingdom that is still fighting for its independence from the queen. So as you might guess from this, we have an enemies to lovers situation going on, and oh my gosh, it was done so well in my opinion. I adored the romance. It felt so authentic and progressed so naturally. I love that it was their core values and strong characters that are drawing them together, but yet because of their situation, it's still very complicated and interesting. The fantasy plot itself was also amazing. I raced through this book. I think I read like the first 2 chapters on a weeknight and then picked it up again on a Saturday morning and wasn't able to put it back down until I finished it later that night. It's been a while since I had that feeling of total immersion in a new fantasy world and that I had no choice but to put the real world on hold so I could finish this story. As soon as I finished Dance of Thieves, I jumped right into the second book, Vow of Thieves. It was that same Saturday, and I think I stayed up until like 3 a.m. reading Vow of Thieves until my eyes finally gave out on me. If I had to choose, I probably liked the first one just a tad bit better, but I still flew through Vow of Thieves, and the fantasy plot got so much more intricate and interesting than I expected. I feel like romance can be difficult to write over multiple books, but the second book continued their story really well. I was still very much invested in both these characters individually and together. I think it really was the characters that elevated this series so much for me. Not only did I love both Kazi and Jace, but all our side characters and the friendships and family relationships present too. I thought the dynamic of Jace's family was so interesting, and you just don't very often get this wholesome family vibe from action-packed fantasy books. But yeah, the world building, the plot, the writing, the characters, the romance, it made for an amazing read. It also renewed my faith that YA can be written without cringy writing or sacrificing the quality of the story. Now, this wasn't some deeply profound or life-changing series, but I feel like these are a perfect example of books that were made for pure entertainment, but they were still made really well. I'm finishing off my spreads for these books by writing my thoughts with this beautiful glass pen. I thought it would be fun since using a dip pen and ink kind of matches the old aesthetic I'm going for, although my writing is a lot messier because I'm still pretty new to using a glass pen. I also added some pictures in the middle of the pages that I found on Pinterest and to me represent the feeling of these books. And those are the completed spreads for my 2 5-star reads in February. Moving on to the next books I picked up, also a fantasy romance duology, we have Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows. Divine Rivals was probably one of the most popular books I saw on social media last year, so I was really excited to read this one. When I finished Dance of Thieves, it was so good, I basically just wanted to read it again, so I was looking for the next best thing in trying another well-loved fantasy romance. And maybe that was the problem, that my expectations were pretty high and I was coming off a new favorite book, but this duology turned out to be just okay for me. So if you haven't heard of it, these books follow Roman and Iris, who are competing journalists during a war between 2 gods. It might technically be a high fantasy, I'm not sure, but it feels like it's set in 1950s England to me. The thing I liked about Divine Rivals was that it was super fast and entertaining. I think I read it in like 2 days. It definitely held my attention the whole time. But even while basically binge reading it, there were still some things I didn't enjoy. Mainly the setting and the war just weren't that interesting to me and felt very simple and not fleshed out. I think the book was mainly written for the romance, which is totally fine, but if it is a fantasy book with a war plot, I would prefer for that to be a good plot, and if it's not, I would honestly just rather it not be a fantasy at all, so I don't have unrealistic expectations. Maybe that's an opinion not all people share, but I think I was just really disappointed in the lack of depth to the war plot and how the world just didn't feel very magical. I had also heard so many people dote on Rebecca Ross's writing, and again, to me, it was just okay. When I think of fantasy books with beautiful writing that flows really well, I think of Patrick Rothfuss or Catherine Arden in the Winter Night trilogy, which are the books we're going to be talking about on this next page. But this writing just didn't accomplish that for me. I did love the romance by the end of Divine Rivals. It was one of those love stories that gave me butterflies with some of the last scenes, but in the beginning, even the romance felt a little awkward, and it just wasn't Dance of Thieves. Maybe that's the problem, I'm comparing it too much. But I'm honestly just so sad I had this experience. I mean, 3 stars is not a bad rating, but I feel like I'm the only person in the world that didn't absolutely love this book, which is a very lonely feeling. On to Ruthless Vows, which I don't want to talk about for too long because I don't like being super negative about books, but this one was one of my least favorites. It was nothing I liked about Divine Rivals and everything I didn't. So if you loved everything about Divine Rivals, this book would probably be fine. But for me, the romance all but disappeared and what we did get felt really forced. This one also went so much more into the war plot, which I would think would be good since I felt there wasn't enough of that part in the first book, but the plot still remained so flat and one-dimensional. It was just, now I had to spend more time reading about it. So it was like the fantasy parts didn't improve, they just got longer, which honestly made it so hard for me to finish this book. I was so bored, which was the complete opposite experience I had with the first one. I know so many people love this series, which is awesome if that's you. I can definitely see the appeal of Divine Rivals at least, but it just wasn't my favorite. Okay, let's start talking more about books I did really enjoy. This next page is going to be for the second 2 books in the Winter Night trilogy, The Girl in the Tower and The Winter of the Witch by Catherine Arden. The first book in this trilogy was The Bear and the Nightingale, which I read last year and honestly didn't even know was part of a series when I finished it. I just stumbled upon these 2 books in the Libby app and found out. These are historical fantasy and we're following Vasya and her family who live in 14th century Russia. Vasya has the ability to see the world of Russian folklore and all its magic and creatures, and she's trying to use this to protect her family and home while also battling against the constraints that come with being a woman during this time. These are the two books I listened to on audiobook, which I would highly recommend. The narrator has the most pleasant voice to listen to, and it also adds to the atmosphere of the story, which is one of my favorite things about these books. They're so atmospheric and really transport you to the Russian wilderness and Moscow and the Russian winter. I would highly recommend reading at least the first book, The Bear and the Nightingale, during winter because it has the perfect vibes to cozy up in a blanket with a warm drink while it's snowing or freezing outside. It definitely helped me romanticize winter when I read it in December. What I really enjoyed about these second two books, though, is that the action definitely picked up. The plots moved a lot faster and tackled a lot more, and it became even more of an epic adventure along with maintaining the immersive setting. I also really appreciated that we got to see more of Vasia's brother and sister in these next books because all the siblings are very different, and so it was interesting to see their story from other perspectives. Like I mentioned, I love Catherine Arden's writing. I don't know what it is about the prose, but it flows so well and beautifully. So I'm giving these books 4 stars, same as the first one. The only thing holding me back from this being a 5-star series is that as a Christian, it took away from the experience that I was reading a lot about Christianity versus Russian folklore, with Vasia clearly on the side of the folklore creatures. So that was one aspect of the book that I didn't connect to or love, but as a fiction series just for entertainment, I did enjoy the writing, the setting, and a lot of other parts of the plot. Before we get to the last pages of this setup, I wanted to flip back to my 24 books in 2024 spread since I finally read a few of these in February. So I'm checking those off by adding their star ratings. This is one of my favorite annual spreads of my 2024 setup, and if you want to see how I created it along with all my other reading journal setup spreads, I'll link that video below and at the end of this one so you can check it out. On to our final 2 pages, which are for the last book I read in February, and we'll also do a little reading check-in / TBR for next month too. This left page is for The Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss, which is definitely one of the strangest books I have read. This was my book club's pick for February, so I'm flipping back to my book club spread to paste in the cover. That's where I like to keep a list of all the books we've read together. This book is a novella in the Kingkiller Chronicles universe, and it's all about Ari, one of my favorite characters. If you're not familiar with the Kingkiller Chronicles, it's a trilogy, although we have yet to get the 3rd book from Mr. Rothfuss, and it's a high fantasy story about an orphaned boy who is attending a prestigious magical university and trying to solve the mystery of his parents' murder. If you like high fantasy, epic fantasy, you definitely have to read this series. Like I mentioned earlier, I love this author's writing, and his world and characters and plots are all fantastic too. So like I said, this novella is about one of our side characters, Ari, who is the sweetest and strangest character you'll ever read about, and because of her nature, this novella is extremely weird. To just give you a taste of who Ari is, here's one conversation between her and our main character, Quoth. "What did you bring me?" Quoth countered. Ari grinned. "I have an apple that thinks it's a pear," she said, holding it up, "a bun that thinks it's a cat, and a lettuce that thinks it's a lettuce. It's a clever lettuce, then." "Hardly," she said with a delicate snort. "Why would anything clever think it was a lettuce?" "Even if it is a lettuce?" I asked. "Especially then," she said. "Bad enough to be a lettuce. How awful to think you are a lettuce, too." So Ari is definitely different. We don't know her backstory, and this novella doesn't give us her backstory, just a few small clues. But I still liked it because I love Ari, and it was fascinating, even if it was a little bizarre, to see the world from her perspective. I will say I have no idea if a lot of the details about the objects in the novella were actually intentional by the author and it was chock full of deeper symbolism, or if a lot of the book was just meaningless gibberish as it appears to be at a quick glance, just to illustrate that Ari is a little broken mentally. I would love to pick the author's brain about that. But it was very interesting, strangely cozy, and I would definitely recommend it if you like Ari. I'm finishing off the page with a quote from the book. I really like how this book spread turned out. I printed some illustrations from the novella and also got to use my Law of Attraction tape set from the WASHI tape shop, which I thought went perfectly. Now for our last spread of this setup, it's going to include 3 sections, one for books I'm currently reading, one for my March TBR, and one for DNFs. I feel like when I started keeping a monthly reading journal, I felt this pressure to finish the books I had started by the end of the month, so it would fit into this journal format. But I never want my journal or reading goals and trackers to make reading feel stressful or forced. So I decided this month to try out a new format of just tracking kind of where I am and a few books I might want to read next. So I'm drawing 3 boxes for those different sections, and as you can see, I accidentally drew one of the lines off, so I'm using a white gel pen to fix that. Currently, I'm reading the bullet journal method, which I've been reading very slowly since January so I can implement as I go. And then I'm in the beginning of both The Angel's Game, which is a follow-up to The Shadow of the Wind, and Why We Sleep, which is nonfiction. If you've been watching my bullet journal videos, you know I've been trying to focus on improving my sleep schedule. In addition to continuing those books, I had a few others I wanted to read in March, which is the second section. First is Dante's Inferno, which is our book club book and is definitely out of my comfort zone, but it's already made for some great book club discussion so far. Also Anastasia, which is another Russian historical fantasy because I enjoyed the Winter Night trilogy so much. And then I figured since I'm kind of on a Russian historical fiction run, I might as well try War and Peace next, since that was one of my annual reading goals. And then we have another classic that I cannot believe I haven't read, Anne of Green Gables. I don't know if I'll get to this in March, but I would love to finally read this series this spring. And then I finally decided to DNF Sisters Under the Rising Sun after getting about a third of the way through in January and just never wanting to go back to it. This is a World War II historical fiction, which is normally one of my favorite things to read, but I just couldn't handle the writing in this one. It felt so theatrical and not serious, and the dialogue felt so scripted. But I really hate DNFing books, especially after I've already read over 100 pages. So I am in a long wait list for the audiobook of this. I figured if it feels like I'm reading a play, maybe it will be a better experience listening to it. So we'll see what happens there. And with that, my February reading journal is all set up. Let's do a final flip through to look at all the spreads together. I always have so much fun creating these reading journal pages and talking about books with you guys. Let me know your thoughts on any of these books, or I'd love to hear any recommendations. Thank you guys so much for watching, and happy reading!